Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Library, where Star Wars is in print, the Force is with the readers, and we are taking a look at canon this time. Buckle in, it's going to be a bumpy ride. Maybe for some. I imagine the comments will be filled with a lot of ignorance this time around. Not from everyone, of course, but this topic does tend to bring that out in people. I'm your host, Nathan P. Butler, and in this episode, probably ought to give you my bona fides here. I am the creator and compiler of the Star Wars Timeline Gold, which you can find at the address below, starwarsfanworks.com/timeline. I do Star Wars Beyond the Films as a podcast with Mark Hurlman, have done Chrono Radio and other ones in the past. I am also someone who has been given a chance at one point to write for Star Wars Tales, so I am a contributor to the official continuity, did dated battle maps and such to go along with the Essential Atlas, and I've been consulted from time to time on some continuity and chronological things. Also an influencing individual when it comes to something like, for instance, convincing Leland Chee that when it comes to the in-universe calendar, it should be 12 months instead of 10, and we just assumed that on those earlier dates from, say, galaxy-wide news nets, we never saw months 11 or 12 as sort of a factor we had to go into when making the dated battle maps. Also the person who got the chance to set down in stone, at least in the Legends or official continuity, the exact starting date of the film Return of the Jedi. So hopefully those bona fides give you a sense that I'm someone who knows quite a bit when it comes to Star Wars continuity and chronology and whatnot. Have a lot of experience in that area. And as such, between that and having that acknowledged from time to time by some official folks, hopefully that'll give you a sense that I'm not going to fill you with a bunch of BS here and interpretations, but instead, the way things have been. Whether we like it or not, the way things have been over time and the way things are now. What we're looking at this time, it's a special episode. We're going to be looking not at one particular publication, but instead at the concept of canon. C-A-N-O-N in Star Wars. Canon with 2 N's in the middle, 3 total, is what you shoot. Canon with 2 N's total, only 1 in the middle, that is, in theory, supposed to be the most authoritative document or source on a particular subject. And in the case of Star Wars, I would best define the term canon as misused over time. It's a word that's been bandied about quite a bit in the past and has led to a lot of confusion. What we want to do with this episode is basically try to explain it all, or at least as much as we can in a compact form here, as a way of making sure that things are clear going forward, especially because in April of 2014, which is just recently, we got a new announcement that really was a sea change in the way that certain things are being handled within Star Wars continuity, especially in the continuity made up of publishing, not as much with the films, of course. So let's take a look at this, kind of building it up as we go along. Little subtitle, happy this time around, because let's face it, there's a lot to cover. Now, you can make the argument that the Star Wars saga, in public view at least, really began in 1976, not 1977. In late 1976, we see the publication of the novelization of the original Star Wars film. Now, of course, we know it as Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. The novelization was listed as being written by George Lucas. It wasn't. It was based on George Lucas's film scripts in somewhat earlier draft form than what we actually see on screen. But it was written, ghost-written, by Alan Dean Foster, who'd also go on to write Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the first spin-off novel for Del Rey, and go on to write eventually The Approaching Storm, a book that leads into Attack of the Clones. Now, of course, in 1977, 80, and 83, we got A New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi in theaters. And around in that era, there were already Star Wars spin-off materials. We got novels, right? We got Splinter of the Mind's Eye, we got the Han Solo Adventures by Brian Daley, we got L. Neil Smith's Lando Calrissian Adventures. We wound up getting novelizations of all 3 films by the time all was said and done by Foster, Glutt, and Kahn. We also had a Marvel Comics series out there that began with an adaptation of A New Hope, continued into new stories between A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back, did an Empire Strikes Back adaptation, continued on after that in the era between that film and Return of the Jedi, got to Return of the Jedi and did a separate mini-series covering that, and then got a chance to continue after Return of the Jedi for about a month worth of stories in continuity, dealing with the Nagai invasion, the Toffs and whatnot, Lumaya, the Dark Lady of the Sith, all that stuff taking place in the post-Return of the Jedi era. You also had a newspaper strip out there by Manning and then Williamson and Goodwin that we saw in the LA Times newspaper syndicate syndicated comic strip out there, what is now usually thought of as classic Star Wars because that's the name it was reprinted under for Dark Horse Comics many years later. And of course, Marvel was putting out other side stuff. They were putting out some stuff in Marvel UK that was exclusive and then reprinted most of it here in the US, Marvel Illustrated Books stuff and things like that. They did stories in Marvel's Pizzazz. But these different lines of publishing, Del Rey's novels, the comics from Marvel, the newspaper strips from LA Times Syndicate, and even really early video games like Atari games, were never meant to be one continuity. The novels did not have to have any relation to or any reference to the comics and vice versa. They didn't have to have references or vice versa to the newspaper strips. They were all considered different publishing lines, the same way that most franchises at the time dealt with their spin-offs. The spin-offs were simply confined to that particular company. They can build off each other, like the Han Solo novels building off of each other, but you weren't going to wind up seeing them all as a cohesive whole. They're just spin-offs, after all. Just little money-making opportunities for other companies in other media based on the success of a film franchise. That was it. There really was no such thing as a coherent Star Wars saga at the time. It was the films, the novels, the comics, all sort of as their own separate things, with the films, though, forming the foundation, the bedrock, upon which the novels, comics, and so forth were built. That will wind up being the case throughout the entire span of the Star Wars saga. But going forward, we'll see that is slightly altered in the face of the canon announcement from 2014 and the concept of legends, which, again, we'll get into in just a moment. So at least initially, no desire, no intention of linking all these things together. They were later, but not yet. Then comes 1991. This is a gigantic sea change in the way that Star Wars continuity is dealt with, but not the last one. At this point, Lucas gives Lucasfilm permission to create an official continuation of his saga. Will it be real in the eyes of George Lucas? No. He can do whatever he wants. If he wants to make a sequel trilogy later, which at the time he was still talking about, but of course he changed his mind on that back and forth and back and forth. First it was a one-film saga starting with and ending with what we know now as A New Hope. Then it was supposed to be a 12-episode saga starting with A New Hope, and then it was going to be a 9-episode saga with A New Hope as episode 4, and then it was always intended to be a 6-episode saga, and then it's, well, I said I wasn't going to make any sequels. I never said somebody else wouldn't when Disney took it all over. The story changes quite a bit. But his saga would be the films, and he let Lucasfilm have different licensees, starting with Bantam and Dark Horse Comics, who would write an official continuation that would do something new in sci-fi tie-in materials. It would all be meant to interlock together. The role-playing games, the novels, the comics, the video games, for the most part, will be designed into one continuity to feed off each other, link with each other, and create this expanded universe of Star Wars storytelling. That was a big deal at the time because it was so new in sci-fi publishing. It, of course, kicked off with Heir to the Empire in 1991 from Bantam Spectra, and then, of course, Dark Empire from Dark Horse Comics. But it grew and expanded for decades after that point. And really, in a lot of ways, this is where some of the confusion starts to come in, as far as how this was working at the time. So let's step back. In this first era, 76 up to the early 90s, what really happened when it came to canon? Well, first off, we know that the spin-offs prior to 1991 weren't all meant to fit together. We've emphasized that already. But we've also already kind of got an instance of, well, what counts as more real than something else does when it comes to contradictions. Now, the most obvious one is that we had novelizations out there that were slightly different than the films, especially Alan Dean Foster's novelization of A New Hope. But no one was out there saying, well, it's in the novel, I see it in print, so that takes precedence over what I see on screen in the film. Because that's idiotic. That's kind of obvious because novelizations are just that, novel adaptations of the film. Of course, the film takes precedence over the novels. Same thing with comic adaptations and whatnot. We also got, in that era, radio dramatizations of the first couple of Star Wars films. Not all three until we eventually get to Return of the Jedi in the 90s. But there's that question, well, wait a second, how do these fit in? Well, obviously, the films take precedence over the radio dramas because the radio dramas have to alter dialogue, alter descriptions of things, because it is an audio-only medium. There's a lot more being said by the characters in that to describe the things they're seeing than in the films, because in the films, we as the audience can just see them. So it became obvious that at least initially when it came to the films themselves, there was a hierarchy forming, at least an obvious one. The films taking precedent over the adaptations thereof, as is usually the case. When we get to 1991, they start bringing together all these things to make one cohesive continuity. And you got to know what's in the continuity and what's not. And at the time, what was in continuity or not, what was canon, but that word winds up getting misused quite a bit, was basically just a list of stories. You were in the continuity or you were out. That was it. So in continuity at the time, Heir to the Empire, Dark Force Rising, Dark Empire, and so on and so on and so on. Out of continuity. Well, once Courtship of Princess Leia comes around, oops, the Jedi Prince series by Paul and Hollis Davis, starting with the glove of Darth Vader. Sorry, you're gone because you contradicted stuff, or at least you seemed to because there weren't any future books after book 6. The Marvel stuff, the early Del Rey stuff. No, you guys don't count because you're not part of this new publishing line. They're gone. Just 2 lists. In or out. So we've already got this idea of what fits and what doesn't. But it's not just old stuff doesn't go in or contradictory stuff doesn't go in. The stuff that fits does. They were publishing things like spoofs. You might say, well, wait a second. Are they allowed to publish spoofs? If it's all meant to be one continuity, are spoofs okay? The answer, of course, is yes. But that did mean that they had to separate out spoofs from everything else. There was the in continuity, and out of continuity could include new stuff or old stuff, depending on what was being published at the time. Okay? This is where some of the confusion really gets going, because they start banning out words like canon, quasi-canon, official continuity, non-continuity, and stuff like that, where they're not being used consistently across the board by all the different people who are using these terms officially. Whether we're talking about Lucasfilm, Dark Horse, Bantam, you name it. And it creates sort of this murky soup, adding into the fact that Lucas doesn't look at any of this stuff as a continuation of his saga, but he allows Lucasfilm to see it as a continuation of Lucasfilm's Star Wars saga. So there's this question of, well, does Lucas approve it? Does he not at the time? Turns out, of course, he didn't, except for a few small instances like the death of Chewbacca in Vector Prime and so forth. But there's this sense of, well, wow, this is real. It's the official continuity, which is where we get another naming issue. When it comes to the term expanded universe, that's what they used to refer to it, the expanded universe, or EU. But sometimes the EU was said as if it meant just that one continuity. Other times the term EU was used as if it referred to all the licensed spin-off materials, including the spoofs and everything else. So, what is it? Is it everything? If you ask some people, sure. Is it just that one continuity? Yeah, if you ask other people, sure. So, you need some way to differentiate between those. For me, the way I always referred to it on the Star Wars Timeline Gold at the time was that the official continuity, the official continuation, was the stuff that was meant to fit. And anything that didn't, well, it may be an expanded universe licensed product, we need to call something else, and for lack of a better term, I've called that apocrypha in the past. If you got canon, the stuff that is within what is meant to be true, then you got your apocrypha, the stuff that is not, just using just literary terms for those things. So you have this delineation of the stuff that is the core of everything else that nothing's allowed to contradict or shouldn't be allowed to contradict without Lucasfilm's express permission, which is the films. And then you've got this official continuity that's building off of it, and you got the stuff that's licensed and produced legally from before, or spoofs and things like that, but which is not part of that overall continuity, which didn't really have a name at the time. I was just calling it apocrypha at the time. Eventually we get the name infinities for those non-continuity things that are spoofs, things that are what-if type stories. But that's an inconsistently applied label because they don't retroactively apply it to anything earlier. They just put it on some new stuff. And in some cases, it's what-if stories. In some cases, it's spoofs. And in other cases, you got stuff like Star Wars Tales, where some stories were brought into continuity, some stories weren't, and were considered out of continuity. And because of that ambiguity, they just slapped the Infinities label, not on each individual story, but on entire issues, which doesn't make logical sense in the way they handled a lot of those stories. So the Infinities label becomes sort of a mess in and of itself. But you got the terms canon, there's official versus canon. No, there's canon and quasi-canon. There's the canon that can't be contradicted, and then there's this other stuff. Well, there's my universe, and there's the parallel universe. All this confusing terminology of the time. But the reality being, it's 2 lists. And you got the inviolate part supposedly being the films. Okay, starting in 1991. Then 1997 comes around and Lucas starts tinkering with the films themselves, and we wind up with the special editions. So now we have to say, wait a second, in Lucas's mind, in terms of the continuity, which films take precedence? And this is the era which basically begins the idea that it's the newest version of the films that are considered the real version of those events. So even within the films themselves, a hierarchy is forming. Over time, what we wind up seeing is a delineation, essentially, where you've got the canon, the films, and they refer to things that are direct adaptations of the films as canon back then, or at least on par with the films, except where they contradict. And oddly enough, when they always referenced that back then, they were only referring to the novels and the radio dramas. You never hear the comics referred to that way, which I think is kind of a slight against Marvel at the time. But again, Marvel wasn't really tied into the continuity at that point. But Dark Horse was reprinting their old adaptations, so you'd think that it would be brought in. So what we wind up with is, well, there's the films, the inviolate part, but that includes the novelizations of radio dramas. But wait! The special editions must take precedence over the originals, because that's Lucas's new definitive vision this week. And of course, those have to take precedence over the novelizations and over the radio dramas, because those are just adaptations that have slight alterations for their format, and because of the time they were written in, and so forth. But all of that takes precedence over this official continuity that's all meant to fit together. But don't worry, because there's also room for spoofs and what-if stories, we'll call infinities or apocrypha or whatever, off to the side over here. So we've already got the film stuff, the tied-together stuff, the one continuity that's official in Lucasfilm's eyes but not in Lucas's eyes, and then all that other stuff that's just not meant to all fit, without accurate terminology to pull it all together, because they're making such a mess out of the terminology and such. Then right around 2000, a man named Leland Chee is tasked by Lucasfilm with creating basically a giant database, not of individual Star Wars stories, but of elements within those stories. This character, this ship, this planet, this technology, etc., etc., this swear word even. And this database will be what they use to keep this growing massive continuity under control and consistent. Hopefully. Not by planning it all out as one giant, story conference or something, but by having a reference point that all the writers can go to ask questions, and someone who can check facts when there seems to be contradictions. That's going to be his job. The database is called the Holocron Continuity Database. The man in charge of it, Leland Chee, becomes known as the Keeper of the Holocron in fandom circles. And once that happens, you start to see things in the background that seem to denote that the structure is becoming a little bit more concrete. We know that certain things are taking precedence over others, right? The films, novelizations, and radio dramas often taking precedence over what we see in the official continuity. Those sources taking precedence over others. It's also the era in which we start to see older stuff like the Marvel comics and the Del Rey stuff being drawn back into continuity and being considered part of the overall whole. If there's things that contradict, now those elements are kicked out of continuity, but the rest of it stays. So we've got this hierarchy we're already kind of seeing happening, but it's never been given a name. And finally, in 2004, the classifications that are being used within that continuity database that follow kind of the structure we already saw happening in the first place, finally becomes clear when they tell the public what these different levels are. And at the time, Leland Chee says that what you've got is there's the ideas and elements of stories that come directly from George Lucas. Those get labeled, and they use that term canon again, over and over again. Those get labeled as G canon, or G-level canon, with G standing for George, as in George Lucas. That the Star Wars continuity we've grown to love since 1991, this one that's official in Lucasfilm's eyes but not Lucas's eyes, that could be contradicted by future films if Lucas so willed it, that large continuity will be known as materials that are C canon. Continuity canon. They are in continuity, in that official continuity that began in 91 to expand beyond the films in an official capacity, linking it all together. Notice they're using the word canon again, but using a letter designation to tell the difference between them for the first time to try to make the terminology consistent. At the bottom level, the stuff that was infinities or parodies or apocryphal or whatever gets labeled simply as non-canon, which gives it the moniker in canon. Not in as in I in canon, which make people say, oh, well, it's in the continuity. No. in as in the letter N canon. This is non-continuity. It's legal, it's licensed, but it's not part of that overall whole. Then there's a special category between C and N. It can't just be it's in continuity or it's not, like that old list was, just in this case about elements of stories instead of being about whole stories by themselves. There's got to be someplace in the middle for the things that are questionable. Or maybe they showed up in an odd source like an old RPG magazine article and they're not sure whether to count it, and they will count it if it's referenced by something else, but for now they're just kind of leaving it up in the air. That became S canon, or secondary canon. So we wound up with G canon, Lucas's vision, C canon, Lucasfilm's official continuity, all meant to fit together, based on a core of G canon, the films that tie into all of it, with the newest ones taking precedence, of course, at that point the special editions, but very soon thereafter in 2004, the DVD editions, and then in 2011, the Blu-ray editions of the films. Beneath that continuity, we have S canon, the stuff that was secondary or questionable. Beneath that, N canon, stuff that's non-continuity, but at least it was legally produced. That finally gave us a structure, and gave us a way to see stories be brought into continuity with only elements that contradict thrown out instead of it being entire books. The idea of two lists of books in continuity or out is gone. Instead, now it is element by element by element, which made it a much more dynamic saga, could include a lot more stuff, with a goal to try to keep everything consistent, but when things contradicted, to often, if they're in the same level, like say C canon, to try to give the authority to the newer materials that were probably vetted more recently, unless the bulk of continuity was against it. Like, for instance, when we were doing the Essential Atlas stuff, the dates for Revenge of the Sith. Very, very different between what the Continuity Database says, the Holocron says, versus what Karen Travis used in Order 66, her novel. Everything else is consistent with the Holocron, hers not. So it came down to, well, it's newer, but all these other sources use it. That one, the Order 66 Travis stuff, was what was tossed out, and they stuck with the dates as was originally created and as a lot of other sources had used. But finally, it is an element by element thing. It has never been, ever, that the official continuity / the expanded universe without the Apocrypha / the continuity made up of G canon, C canon, S canon, possibly, but not in canon, that's never been Lucas's saga. It's never been canon on par with the films. It was always the expansion, the licensed material, but an official unified continuity that was an experiment in sci-fi fandom that had never happened before. Lucas could come along and trample it, but hopefully he wouldn't. Then came 2008. And that year, Lucas kind of went back on something he had said before. For a while there were eras in the official continuity of the continuity that's meant to all fit together, the C canon, etc., continuity, where he said, you know what, I might make films in that era, you can't touch it. Like the Clone Wars era. Couldn't do anything with that, it was off limits because he was going to do the prequels. The sequel trilogy era, what he originally planned for a sequel trilogy era, off limits. Basically from 30 years after Return of the Jedi onward, it was 30 years after A New Hope onward, just basically decades afterwards. You couldn't go beyond just a couple of decades after the films because he might make a sequel trilogy and all that. That was off limits, and so on and so on. Okay. Eventually, as he gets to the point where he's making the prequels, he opens up its era. When he says he's not going to make sequels, he opens up the far future. But in that prequel era, he had not allowed writers to touch the Clone Wars, at least not in any great detail. Once the films get going, yeah, have at it, have fun. You know, let's promote these movies like crazy. So you get Dark Horse and Del Rey, who at that point had become the new license holder for Star Wars novels as of about 1999. They're producing stories for the Clone Wars, intricately fitting together with stories taking place days after each other, weeks after, months after, all very meticulously laid out. And then 2008 comes around. And all those stories produced between 2002 and 2008 get kind of blown out of the water, or at least get a wrecking ball taken to them, because Lucas says, you know, I wasn't going to revisit this. I was going to let you play in that era, but screw it, I'm knocking over your sandcastle because I want to play with the Clone Wars now. And he launches the Clone Wars cartoon series. However, this becomes something a little bit different. It's a cartoon series driven in a lot of ways by Dave Filoni and his team, Simon Kinberg and all those guys. But Lucas has heavier direct involvement in that project than he ever did with any other projects, or at least his acknowledgement of ever doing so with any other projects. This needs to be given some kind of special category for itself. It's not all Lucas's vision. It's not G-Canon. But it's not something that's just a spin-off material that Lucas didn't have much involvement in, like C-Canon. What will it be? Well, they decide to give it a new level. They call it T-Canon. T for television. Now, of course, that in and of itself is a bit of a misnomer, because it doesn't include the Ewok telemovies, droids, Ewoks, the Holiday Special, the Clone Wars microseries by Genndy Tartakovsky. None of that. T-Canon became just the Clone Wars cartoon series, but it became a part of this continuity to be somewhat inviolable, very much like G-Canon. But at least it was acknowledged within the Holocron that some of this stuff didn't come from Lucas, some came from Filoni and the other writers. So now we had a new structure. And yes, the era of the Clone Wars was becoming a mess. T-Canon came in and just shattered what was there, and we were told when the Clone Wars really started doing that quite a bit, bringing in Ahsoka, killing off characters that were alive in the rest of the continuity, having characters be alive who were dead in the other continuity and all this stuff. We were told that when the Clone Wars was over, we'd get a definitive order of the episodes, which we did, but then also we would find out how this all was meant to fit together. They would have ironed out the kinks and shoehorned it all together. That is not the case anymore. They've said there is no active plan to do that at all. So at this point, the Clone Wars era remains a mess, but the structure itself changed and became G-Canon, right, George Lucas's vision, T-Canon, television canon, just for the Clone Wars, C-Canon, the stuff that's meant to be part of the continuity from the novels, comics, games, and so forth, right, including the old TV series like Droids and Ewoks, then S-Canon, the questionable stuff, and then N-Canon, the non-continuity stuff that did not count as part of that broader whole. And that was pretty much the way that it stood, from 2008 all the way up through the end of 2013. But behind the scenes, things were changing in 2013. We had Disney come in and buy Lucasfilm, and one of their first announcements was that they were going to be launching a brand new set of Star Wars films, basically a sequel trilogy and other films to go with it. That basically blew the idea of a post-Return of the Jedi continuity somewhat out of the water, and the question was, well, where do we go from here? Around that same era, actually in early January of 2014, we are starting to find out more about how, with Lucas gone, with him being the driving force behind what is inviolable, a new group has been formed to take his place. The Story Group, they call it. Pablo Hidalgo, Leland Chee, and others who will guide continuity in the future to try to make sure it all fits together, including the films. But this begged the question, what are they going to do with these sequel films then, if you got this group that's supposed to make things all fit together? They got films on the horizon, they've got a new cartoon series, Rebels on the horizon. What's going to happen with all of this? What kind of options did they even have? They could just not make any new Star Wars films at all, but that was out the window because they said they were going to. They can make them in eras so far removed from the rest of the Star Wars saga that they don't have a risk of contradicting anything in the official continuity, that C-Canon/G-Canon/T-Canon timeline out there that most fans have taken as their Star Wars, even though it was Lucasfilm's vision of it, not Lucas's. They could just make it so far removed that it has no ties, but then that means it would have no ties to the original characters, and that was unlikely. So then what can they do? They can take the films and either make them adhere to this previously existing continuity, which would mean that film goers would have to understand or be brought to understand a lot of different characters and events that might be referenced or might play into that story that have been showing up in books and comics over the years and have to have an extensive library of knowledge to really get and appreciate what they're seeing on film. That was extremely unlikely. They could come in and do what the Clone Wars did and say, oh, it's all one continuity, we're just smashing a wrecking ball through it and we'll fix it as we go. Or they could simply say, you know what, these new films and the previous films, maybe the Clone Wars, the stuff that all is meant to be part of that broader vision that was influenced by Lucas, even the sequel films being influenced by his outlines and such that he gave to Kathleen Kennedy at Lucasfilm, that is in and of itself its own continuity, its own timeline, its own universe, so to speak. And just like Lucas had said in the past, where he said that there's his saga and the parallel universe of the official continuity stuff, well, you could just say it's separate. That ongoing timeline was meant to all fit together, from 1991 onward that then brought in stuff from 76 all the way up to 91 as well, that's going to be separated out, not get smashed through like a wrecking ball. It'll stay coherently whole, but it will be an alternate universe, a parallel universe to what's happening with the films. It won't need to take into account Rebels or the sequel trilogy, because it will be its own little universe off to the side. And it wound up that, which is the least destructive option to existing continuity, depending on your point of view. Some say, oh, it destroyed all of it, but it did not take a wrecking ball to it and cause a bunch of contradictions again. It separated itself out. That was the decision they decided to go with. So what we wind up with is on April 25th of 2014, there's the announcement that rocked canon for Star Wars and basically said that going forward, the previous Star Wars saga that built up over 1991 up till now, or you could say from 76 up until 2014, actually August of 2014 will be when we see some of the last of it. We'll get to that in a minute. That continuity is itself a parallel alternate universe in a sense. It's kind of what they were hinting at essentially. We can use it, Lucasfilm says, for inspiration for ideas, kind of like different things were used for inspiration, like holocrons and the Night Sisters and such for the Clone Wars, but didn't necessarily fit the way we'd seen it previously in the continuity. But yeah, it's all separated out, and we're going to know that as Star Wars Legends. The Legends continuity. Legends denoting the idea that it all may fit together, but it is essentially not the true story, but an alternate story of that galaxy far, far away. Whereas, in the future, we will see the original Star Wars films, the classic trilogy, and the prequels, presumably in their newest Blu-ray forms, unless they get changed yet again, or Lucasfilm retroactively goes back to the original versions of the original trilogy, which would be nice. Those, plus the Clone Wars, plus things going forward, would become one new continuity. They simply are calling it canon, again, using that word that was so confusing in the past, and saying, no, it won't be confusing, because there simply will be just the canon of Star Wars. And that'll consist of all the things the story group is basically designing to work together. Novels, comics, films, everything. It'll all be equally valid. At least, that's their goal. So in a sense, what has happened as of April of 2014 is what we've got is two main Star Wars timelines that are divergent from each other as parallel universes, essentially. Two different major Star Wars sagas out there, with the one that'll be in public view and growing in the future the most being this new one. Now, the new canon, okay, again, at its core is going to be the films, of course, along with the new films that are coming out. It is already growing at this point. Of previously existing stuff, it pulls in the films, 1 through 6. It pulls in the Clone Wars film and its television series, draws those all in. It's going to grow with Rebels. It's going to grow with the sequel trilogy and such. It will also be growing, of course, in comics, novels, video games, and that sort of thing. None of the Dark Horse comics are making the jump, with one exception. Son of Dathomir, a series by Jeremy Barlow that is based on scripts that were unproduced for later seasons of the Clone Wars. I believe it was for season 6, that would have ended Darth Maul's story in that saga. Because it is based on those Clone Wars scripts and is essentially an adaptation of those are being carried over, so they exist with the Clone Wars in the official continuity, or Legends continuity now, but also they do exist within this new canon timeline. Okay? Otherwise, none of the Dark Horse stuff makes the jump. For the novels, none of the previous novels make the jump, mostly. The argument that they've made is that the novelizations do get to make the jump, presumably because they're not going to write new novelizations of all the films, but they only make the jump insofar as they don't contradict the films. They have to be the things that match the films to be considered part of that. So basically it's the movies that count. None of the original scenes, original characters, original dialogue, any of that cool extra background stuff like in the Revenge of the Sith novel by Matthew Stover that makes Revenge of the Sith make more sense, none of that makes the jump. In a sense, what they're saying with this new continuity going forward is that the stuff that carries over from the previous continuity is the G-canon and T-canon stuff. The Clone Wars, directly influenced by Lucas, but put together in a lot of cases by Dave Filoni and his team, and the stuff from the films. And with the novelizations, since it was element by element, There were parts that were G canon because Lucas came up with it, parts that were C canon because the author just came up with it as part of that licensed novelization. The C canon stuff is Legends. The G canon stuff gets to carry over into the new continuity, this new timeline out there. Beyond that, though, the other previous novels, they're gone. The previous prose fiction, they're gone. In terms of novels, we'll get A New Dawn, Heir to the Jedi, Lords of the Sith, and Tarkin as our first novels by Del Rey to fit into that new continuity. They have already started publishing prose fiction in that continuity, though. Just like with Son of Dathomir being out before the change to Marvel, already giving us some comics in that continuity, Star Wars Insider, the short stories in there as of issue number 149, Blade Squadron Part 1, the short stories in Insider, the prose fiction, those are in continuity with this new canon. And of course, going forward, we'll have video games and the aforementioned sequel trilogy, other films, and Rebels coming along. But G and T canon that form the core of the Legends continuity are essentially copied and pasted into this new canon with other stuff building on top of it in the future. Meanwhile, the C canon stuff, along with any S canon stuff that was carried over, that official continuity with at its core G and T canon, the Clone Wars and the films, at least the first 6 films and the Clone Wars film, that remains whole as a timeline. And we still need to kind of keep in mind those designations, but that is the Legends continuity now. The stuff that was in canon, never in continuity in the first place, well, it's still non-continuity stuff. There's still parodies and what-if stories and stuff like that. No big deal. They're still out there. So in a sense, what you've got is the unique situation of 2 alternate timelines, but there is some overlap. But the overlap is episodes 1 through 6, Clone Wars film, Clone Wars series, the cartoon series, and Son of Dathomir. Nothing else is overlapping right now between those 2. So when Rebels comes out, it does not affect the Legends continuity. It goes to that new canon. When the sequel trilogy comes out, it does not affect the Legends continuity. It remains the same. It goes to the new canon. What we're finding is that the Legends continuity is pretty much grinding to a halt. As of August of 2014, Dark Horse Comics will be done producing new Star Wars comics. They'll spend the next few months of 2014 putting out new omnibus editions, new trade paperbacks, but that's basically it. Then Marvel is supposed to pick up in 2015 with new Star Wars comics going forward. That'll be part of that new canon. The novels are already done for that. The last of the novels being produced by Del Rey as part of that continuity, well, that was Honor Among Thieves, the story that was basically Empire and Rebellion Book 2, and then they broke that trilogy down into basically just standalone novels. There are some things that are continuing, it seems, within that continuity. According to a Lucasfilm representative who talked to GameSpot, the gaming website, Star Wars The Old Republic, the MMO saga, will continue. That game by BioWare and EA that you can play on PC, that continues, and it continues as it was before. Part of the C canon, or the official continuity / Legends continuity stuff. It is not going to, by virtue of existing, retroactively turn that entire game into part of this new canon. It's not going to work like that. The same, presumably, though they haven't said officially, is happening with Fantasy Fight games. They've, of course, got their different role-playing games out there, Edge of the Empire, Age of Rebellion, and the upcoming Force and Destiny. They've got their Star Wars LCG living card game called Star Wars The Card Game, and they've also got their X-Wing miniatures game, all of which delve into the expanded universe for characters, ships, technologies, and the like. And so far, it looks like that will continue to build on itself, which means it's continuing to build in the Legends continuity. Again, that is an assumption. That is what seems to be the case. They have not officially said so, but logically, it's really the only thing that makes sense given the other materials they've produced, unless they have to make a clean break and say, sorry, you can't use these cards with these cards because these were from Legends and these aren't. And that seems very unlikely to me. As Legends is kind of grinding down to a slow trickle, we have the booming nature of what should be coming in the near future, of course, with this new canon. Terminology-wise, all we've got that they're calling it is simply canon, meaning it's on par with the films, and they're trying to keep that terminology. But fans are trying to find a way to differentiate that from all the other ways they've used the word canon before, and all those lettered canons that we now understand as a way to denote the parts of the official continuity, or Legends continuity, Legends timeline, Legends universe at this point. So as such, we're hearing some people call this the new canon, But Lucasfilm is coming back saying, no, it's not new canon. These novels aren't new canon replacing old canon because those old novels were never Lucas's vision. They were never on par with the films. Yeah, but you use the word canon a lot, so people are trying to find a way to differentiate it. So some are calling it new canon, though Lucasfilm seems to be balking at that terminology. My partner for Star Wars Beyond the Films in podcasting, Mark Hurlman, likes to call it D-canon, standing for Disney canon, using a letter. I personally don't prefer to use the letter because it suggests that it is tied into that old system and somehow an official term. It's not, and it's not used as a classification. Now, realistically, will there someday be a contradiction within this new continuity, perhaps between a novelization of the films and the films themselves as they put out the sequel trilogy? Oh yeah, absolutely. Of course that kind of thing's going to happen, even on a small scale. And yes, at some point they'll have to draw a line and say what takes precedence over what. But for now, until we get that kind of delineation going on in that new continuity, the assumption is it's all equally valid. They're not using any distinguishing names or letters, so calling it D-canon to me seems a little bit nonsensical. It doesn't really make sense if that's the approach they're taking because it's not meant to fit into that old GTCSN setup that existed within the Holocron Continuity Database. Probably these are going to have some other kind of designation if they're in a database at all, but we don't know what that designation is. Personally, I've taken to calling this story group canon, or story group driven canon, or the story groups canon, or the canon from the story group, emphasizing the story group aspect, obviously there, because they're the ones guiding this now and trying to keep it all cohesive straight through without a individual like Lucas having power over that to then come in and smash everything. The story group is the power on high in this case, and they are actively trying to make it all fit together in a way that Lucas having that power and Lucasfilm trying to coordinate everything else with him always being able to come in and crush it if he wants to, the way that never really lent itself to a safe, cohesive whole. May have felt safe, but then comes new films or the Clone Wars and things start to get shifted and shattered. Heck, all the way back to stuff like, oh wait, all these stories had Han shooting first against Greedo, and now he doesn't anymore, thanks to 1997. So, I hope this very long episode has gone a long way to explaining and helping you understand the nature of Star Wars canon. It is something that has evolved over the years. It has changed numerous times. Terminology was bandied about in a very loose way until we got the Holocron Continuity Database breakdown of the different lettered levels. And now things have changed again. There is a nameless, at this point, with fans adding ways to describe it, new continuity. Legends does still exist, but it's an alternate universe, and they're not going to focus on producing a lot of stuff for it, but there seems to be a trickle of new things. This new continuity is building, and the only places where they seem to cross over and connect are episodes 1 through 6, Clone Wars, Son of Dathomir. And that's pretty much it, except the parts of the novelizations that do align exactly with the films. Hopefully this makes some sense as to how this affects any of my projects, the Star Wars Timeline Gold, this video series, and things like that. That is something we will address in our next episode. So keep an eye out for that one. It's coming very soon. For now, I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for watching and listening to me ramble on in this quasi-dissertation on canon. Yike. And may the Force be with the readers. Old continuity or new. Or both, like me. Good night, everybody.